All right, John, I think we are underway. It's Glenn Laurie at The Glenn Show. Patreon.com/Glenn Show with John McWhorter. We're the Black Guys at BloggingHeads.tv. And we are doing our weekly, I should say our monthly response to questions that patrons have submitted. $10 per month tier patrons get to submit questions. $5 and $10 a month tier patrons get to see our responses to these questions, which we do on a monthly basis. This is our March response to questions for the Black Guys at BloggingHeads.tv. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Glenn. Let's answer these questions that come to us, which is a fun thing, actually. Yeah,
it is a fun thing, actually. I invite you to get us started.
Well, one question that somebody asked me was, will my book, The Elect, be an audiobook? And the answer to that is yes, and I will read it. And I will also announce here that sooner than I expected, The Elect has sold. The Elect will be published as a physical object this fall, probably in November. It has to wait a little while because my book, 9 Nasty Words on Profanity, is coming out in May. But there will be an Elect that you can hold. So that happened yesterday. And yes, of course, there will be an audiobook. So that's my first question answer.
Okay, so why don't you go on to a question now, having made an important announcement to that effect?
You want like a real question? Okay.
Yeah, like a real question.
Okay, so for example, Evan Griffith says that he's noticed that certain thinkers, and he lists Robin DiAngelo and Michael Eric Dyson as examples. Those are his examples, not mine. He says that they have a methodology of 1, starting with a foundation of largely indisputable facts, 2, emotionally igniting their implications, and 3, concluding extreme measures are the only practical solution to hot button issues. And Evan Griffith says that this has become tired and painfully obvious. And he asks, what is the genesis of this methodology? And is this new to our public discourse? Is it more successful now than it's been in the past due to some new cultural factors that might be at play, lending them power? And I found that an interesting question because I think that what he means is this, there's a certain maybe rabble-rousing aspect to this. And I'm not sure Michael Eric Dyson does it, but I would certainly say that you could read that as what somebody like Robin DiAngelo is doing. And I think that there are 2 things to remember. And one of them is that stirring up the crowd with passionate discourse and maybe even slightly exaggerated claims, I wouldn't say that that's new. It's that talking about race issues that way has acquired a certain purchase on our discourse, especially since roughly June of last year. And I think that part of the reason for that is, the passions that were ignited by everybody having been inside for so long. And then you have a particularly egregious cop killing of George Floyd. And then you have also something that hasn't been charted that much yet, I think, is that people spending an awful lot of time in the rather bizarre circumstance of living most of your life on Zoom. I think that has a way of igniting passions in a way that might not have happened if more of these meetings were taking place in rooms with people breathing each other's air. But yeah, we see more of this kind of exaggeration in the discourse now. It pains me to say, race has been talked about that way since roughly 1966 by certain representatives of Black thought. What's happened recently is that a critical mass of white people, instead of just a few fellow travelers, are now adopting that way of looking at race issues too and giving it their imprimatur, so to speak. And so to me, I don't hear Robin DiAngelo's way of looking at these things. Or, I would say it's not Michael Eric Dyson so much as maybe Nicole Hannah-Jones. And I'm not saying that she's walking around whipping up crowds, but still that rather apocalyptic way of looking at things, that has acquired a real purchase of late because now mainstream organs are treating it as truth rather than it being the philosophy of certain interesting but only so influential and mostly Black thinkers from universities. So yeah, there is a sea change going on. But no, this isn't new. And frankly, this goes back to, Huey Long. There have always been people who stirred up the crowd. But in terms of race, more lately, yes, because mainstream organs are pretending to agree with the philosophy.
Okay, I wonder how you would respond to this speculation. I'm translating that question as why so much demagoguery in the race debate, and I wonder how you would respond to this speculation, which is basically because people have such a weak hand that that they're kind of driven to screaming because argument is not going to get them out of the box. When I say a weak hand, I mean you talk about mass incarceration. That really is a reflection, the racial aspect of that, isn't it? Of a very high rate of criminal offending, of violence, of lawlessness in certain quarters of the Black community. Not only there, but there disproportionately so. You constantly say, John, I'm giving just one example, mass incarceration. The general thesis is people in a corner, the actual facts backing them into a corner. Out of desperation, they're lashing out. The demagoguery and the over-the-top character of the rhetoric is in part a reflection of the weakness, not the strength of the hand that they're playing. This is a tantrum that's being thrown, a protracted enactment of a tantrum. It's a fit. And people are driven to it almost mad by the unbearable weight of the facts. And I'm giving mass incarceration as one example. Other examples could be given. But if you actually looked at homicide rates, if you looked at criminal offending rates, if you looked at what's actually going on, these encounters with the cops are often tainted by malfeasance, by resistance, by violence on the part of the person who is wrongly treated by the police and so forth and so on. And it's an effort to control the discourse through emotion, rage, and anger, because the objective facts on the ground, affirmative action is failing in many places, like the Georgetown Law School. I press this thesis. I know it's being, very arch in the way I'm saying it, but people are sitting in constitutional law. They're sitting in contracts. They're sitting in torts. They're sitting in civil procedure. Stuff is hard. They're in over their heads, some. And anybody who points out the actual objective fact pulls a scab off of a wound. It's gaping. It's painful. And the reaction, let's sit and look at the facts. Let's consider the implication of the policy of admitting with lower SAT scores. Let's examine the career prospects. Let's weigh the relative equities. Let's, on balance, try to decide if we're doing good or if we're doing bad here. Let's be honest about what the real... That's a very, very, very painful conversation, and much more satisfying to scream racist, racist, racist. And on the other side of that transaction, much easier to capitulate, apologize, bow and scrape than to actually grapple with the difficulties. So reality is just too painful. Tantrum throwing and play acting demagoguery, seizing microphones from people, telling people to shut up, telling them what they can and can't say about an issue, calling them names, calling them racist, trying to cancel them, drive them out of the conversation. This is the last refuge of a scoundrel.
I don't know, Glenn. I really don't know. Your analysis assumes that there's a certain kind of, say, student who knows that they're in over their heads and therefore tries to compensate or distract from it by making a lot of noise. I can imagine that person, but I'm not sure that's what's going on in their heads because, and this is what hurts to say, a lot of them have never been asked to do what it is that they're not doing as well as the other students. Frankly, the system keeps on lifting them through. And with a lot of them, I don't think it's that they feel inadequate to performing the legal analysis that they're asked to do. Because remember, with a lot of them, they've never been required to do anything like that. It's a mode of thought that education has not ushered them into. And so, if anything, I think they really might genuinely think this is racist rather than this is something that I'm not good at. I can imagine that a person like that really would think that what makes them significant, what makes them important, is decrying racism, not doing their law school work just like everybody else. That wouldn't be different enough, and it wouldn't be Black enough. It would be almost I think with some of them, they feel like it will be turning their back on their blackness to just sit there and do the work in a race neutral fashion. So I don't know. But yes, if they feel it, if they're in over their heads, maybe they're thinking, wow, I can't do this. That's undignified. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to become dignified by becoming a race warrior. We're going to talk about how racist everything is. And therefore, people won't know that really I can't quite do the work the way the white person next to me could. But I don't know if that's necessary. I think a lot of them come primed to be good Black people by decrying the racism in the system, as opposed to doing something so dull as just sitting and participating in it. I don't know. I'd have to know them.
I'm speculating. I don't know. My students and I, in one of my courses, are reviewing the summer of 2020 and the George Floyd phenomenon and the protest and rioting afterwards. And so we went back to the debate about looting. You may remember there was a piece in the New York Times by a woman called Osterweil, I forget her first name, who had a book called In Defense of Looting, which was written after the Michael Brown affair in Ferguson. Right. Yeah. Jennifer Osterweil. Mm-hmm. And so I'm reading these pieces. Robin G.D. Kelly has one in the New York Times, and they're making arguments. Looting is going on, arson is going on, as they write in cities all across the country, dozens of cities where people are breaking through shop windows and walking off with stuff, setting fires, throwing projectiles at police officers, and so forth. Peaceful protests become sometimes into riotous disorder. And they're saying things like, this country is founded on looting. We looted the land from the Native Americans. We looted the labor from the... Now, the idea that the United States of America was founded on looting is a one-dimensional, stick-figured, cartoon-like, laughable account of the development of the American social and political economy. It's laughable. I'm talking about scores of millions of immigrants coming to the country, for example, and settling it. I'm talking about the development in the 19th century of a China-like emergence of a major economic force, manufacturing and trading power, which matures in the early 20th century, which is the United States of America, ultimately after the Second World War, displacing Britain and so forth as the global hegemon. Founded on looting? That's your account? Your account of American history is looting? Your answer to people burning down bodegas on the corner and going into Targets and clearing off the shelf is that the country is founded on looting. That's not serious. It's not serious history. It's not serious ethics. It's not serious politics. And what made me wonder, what I was wondering was, how does that end up on the pages of the New York Times? How does that end up as a master narrative for certain self-consciously progressive and supposedly enlightened critic?
Because white people like it when we jam. Obviously it's
because
not.
We ain't got no cards to play.
It's because it's music. Bluffing. It's a movie. And that's what we're supposed to do. It's a variation on us as entertainers. And somebody who writes that kind of thing knows that will get more attention than anything else that they might write. It's a very Black thing to write. They think of it as their duty. And then you have these people who pretend to agree with it, or, they'll say, well, this view should be at the table. They know damned well that they would never put forth that view, and they'd be appalled if their children did. But we jam. We're colorful. We're funkadelic. That's what that is. It's a pat on the head. But we're supposed to pretend that it's prophecy. It's disgusting.
There is John making one of his master points. I assume you elaborate again in The Elect, John.
So, yeah, I'm glad you're reading it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Shall I move on to a question then?
Yeah.
Perhaps this is Cole Astaire asking, perhaps you could make a few comments on how you and your spouses, it's directed to both of us, John, keep politics from affecting your romantic lives. I don't know much about John's family, but I know that Glenn's wife seems to disagree with him. How do you make that work? Well, Cole Astaire, you perceive correctly that my wife and I don't agree about a lot of stuff. My lovely wife, LaJuan, who has made cameo appearances here at the Glenn Show and with whom John has enjoyed pleasurable company.
Many times, yeah.
Is a Bernie Sanders Democrat. And worse than that, she's a news junkie Bernie Sanders Democrat who stays on top of all the podcasts and all of the critical articles coming out about this, that, or the other, and is constantly challenging me on stuff that I say on the Glenn Show. And actually, I don't know how many of these episodes between me and John that she's actually watched from front to back. I think she probably gets halfway through and it turns her stomach so much that she can't bear to hear it out. How do we manage? With great difficulty. Cole is there, with great difficulty. I actually haven't thought systematically about what the guidebook is for negotiating these treacherous waters. But I'll say a few things. One is we never go to bed mad at each other. That's a rule. We don't, you know, we have the snit. Sometimes we have the snit. I can't believe you said that. Haven't you read this? And then the feedback is, oh, you don't respect me. You think I'm not reading. You think I'm not informed. You think you're the only person who knows something because you're a professor, blah, blah, blah. He's a jackass. This is a politician that I like that she's referring to as a jackass. Okay, not Donald Trump, not Donald Trump. Anyway, or you're always talking about cancel culture. Why don't you talk about the minimum wage? I don't hear you talking about the minimum wage, bread and butter issues. These are fish in a barrel that you're shooting, all the stupid stuff that these kids are doing on the college campuses, blah, 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 blah. Or I'll say something like, you know, Cardi B with that WAP stuff. I get it. I get why you can't take your eyeball off of the rotating buttocks. But really, it's not art and it's not good for our kids. And it warrants to be somehow criticized, even as we accept the fact that there's a First Amendment and blah, 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 blah. And she will say, what decade were you born in again? Stuff like that. We try not to hold a grudge. That's one thing. We try not to bite our tongues, however. I think that's very bad. I think developing the habit of simply suppressing the disagreement because you anticipate that it's going to be unpleasant and you nod and go along, and then you hold a resentment within yourself, feeling bullied by the fact that you can't express your opinion without getting an earful, is unhealthy. There's a kind of passive-aggressive negativity that's embedded within that because you're now a victim of the fact that you can't speak your mind freely without anticipating that it's going to elicit some kind of negative response. Another thing that I'll say, the question is, how do you manage with the disagreement not to ruin your romantic lives? Another thing I'll say is we listen, or at least I try to be very careful about this, not shutting myself down in the middle of the second sentence of the argument that she's making because I know where it's going and I know that I disagree with it, but try to listen. Try to be generous. Where I can agree, I agree. Man, believe me, I agree. I send over to you. See, I saw this. This is exactly the argument you were making the other day, and I think this person is right. I send that kind of note weekly on where I can find agreement, where I can find affirmation. Agree. But of course, we have to have something other than politics to talk about. I mean, it can't just be argument. And so there is a wide sphere of areas of mutual interest that we can somehow repair to. But I'll confess, it is troubling sometimes the tensions that bubble up to the surface between us. And we have to be careful. We have to be mindful. Gratuitous offense, gratuitous affront, sarcasm, passive aggressive self-pity. These are things one can become more aware of in oneself, and one can try to work to stifle them down. Sometimes saying nothing at all is the best reaction, especially if you can feel yourself going into one of those darker places of anger, self-pity, and so on. There have been times when we have agreed to disagree. I have gone to another room and we've checked back again in 90 minutes or a couple of hours after I finished that chapter in the book, and she finishes, doing whatever she's doing over on the other side of the house. Having a big house helps. It helps a lot. I can go to the lower level. I got a pool table down there, you know, got a little TV and a little futon, put my feet up, watch a basketball game, let it chill, let it cool out, and then hook back up for dinner that night. It's not perfect. And we've only been married 3+ years. So, your prayers are welcome. John, you got anything to say to Cole on this question?
Not as much as you. I guess this is the first time I've said on our show that 2 falls ago, my ex-wife and I split, actually. And so I've been a single dad since then. This was about 6 months before the lockdown happened. And I would say on that subject that she is very intelligent, very educated, and a great person, but she's further to the left than I am. And I don't think she would have any argument with my saying that she is woker than I am. And I don't mean excessively woke, but she is woker than I am. And I think she would have much less of a problem with the development since last summer than I do. And later in our marriage, I was beginning to notice a certain divergence between us in terms of my feelings about, various things that, going on in the media, various ideological currents, and hers. And it was beginning to even affect what kind of company we preferred to keep. And this was not officially why our marriage ended. However, I would say that I am glad that if it had to end, it was over by what happened last summer and what's happened since, because I can imagine conversations would have gotten a little awkward, kind of like what you're describing. And, my living space is fairly big, but we have 2 small kids and it would have been harder to stay away from each other. And I would say that she's a great person. There were great things about our marriage, but I find it hard to imagine myself now moving on with someone who wasn't in basic agreement with my skepticism of a lot of these modern developments. And I guess it's partly just that you continue changing and developing as you go through life. And I'm at a point here in my, middle age where I have quite a strong sense of myself with a capital S as being someone who has certain commitments, and those commitments include pushing back against the excesses of what is now being called wokeness. Some people think we're against woke. I think of myself as thoroughly woke. My issue is wokeness that's mean. And to the idea that all of these things going on are somehow permissible, that it's inevitable excess that we should just look upon and click our tongues. Not that my ex ever said anything like this, but a hypothetical person who would. That wouldn't work for me. I need to come talk about, making dinner and watching the basketball game, although in my case, it would be an old movie or something like that. I would need to do those things with somebody who was not put off by my not feeling the way the New York Times op-ed page felt about something. At this point, I would not want to have to build bridges about things like that. So yeah, that's an interesting thing. When I've started thinking about, okay, I'm out there. Who's it going to be? I thought, well, it's limited partly because I've got to be with somebody who gets why I would write a book like The Elect. So that is my answer to that question to Mr. Cole Astaire. Talk about an old movie. That's a great name. Sounds like a character in an old movie. So yeah.
Yeah, Cole Porter and Fred Astaire is what you're thinking about. Yeah, we got to get Ginger Rogers in there somewhere. Yeah. And, just another word on this, because I hear what you're saying. I relate to what you're saying at a deep level. I mean, I feel like I'm on a mission and I want my soulmate to be on the same mission with me. You know what I mean? I want to know that she's got my back, that she's rooting for me, that she's following my play and that she's cheering me on. And I don't always feel that, and I miss it. I do. The other side of that, though, is there's a built-in kind of critic that has got me always questioning myself, and maybe a cheerleader would be bad for a guy like me. Maybe that would I'd lose my governing mechanism, and I tend to go a little bit overboard because I get reinforcements to my worst tendencies of ranting, wild-eyed rage, at the machine of third wave anti-racism, as you put it in your book, of wokeness. And I lose touch. I mean, for example, let me give you just one example. I know this is your question, but oh no, it was my question. Okay, so I could do this. Which was that, I think the universities are going to hell in a handbasket under the management of the anti-racist brigades, of the diversity and inclusion structures, of the students who are demanding social justice be demonstrated and moral righteousness be signaled with every action in the university, the people who are raging against the colonial imposition of the Western canon in the curriculum, et cetera. Here at Brown, there's now a petition circulating among students to reinstate a required course. Brown is famous for having an open curriculum where there are no requirements. And that's a matter of principle, of a kind of pedagogic ideological stand. There are no requirements. Students make up their own program here at Brown with the guidance and input of the professors, but there are no requirements. Different departments may have requirements for meeting their concentration standards, but there are no university requirements. They've talked about imposing the requirement of people taking an anti-racism course universally of people who matriculate here at Brown. And, I'm against it. I'm strenuously against it. I'm a prominent person in the political life of the community. And, I'm thinking about writing a piece. And my wife is counseling me against it. Don't stick your neck out like that. Don't stand in opposition to the students and whatnot. And I'm saying, these kids, they don't know what the hell they're doing. And they're, there's no parental supervision because, my colleagues won't stand up for any principle and whatnot. And she says, I had told her about a letter that I received from Alden Morris. Alden Morris is a very distinguished sociologist at Northwestern University, an African-American who's written a book about the origins of the civil rights movement that was published, I think, in the 1980s. And anyway, it's a classic. It's a classic study of the civil rights movement, Alden Morris. And he and I attended the same community college in 1969, John, when you were 4 years old. We attended the same community college as Black kids, kind of intellectual, coming up on the South Side, not quite doing as well as we might have been doing. And we needed some place to go and, take some classes. He and I attended the same. He's now a tenured professor, very distinguished. I'm sure he has a chair at Northwestern in sociology, still lives in Chicago. I am who I am. And Alden wrote me a letter during the height of the post-Ferguson turmoil, when I was also on a tear about the students being off base, about Black Lives Matter being not what you want to say. And he counseled me to remember my roots. And I had told my wife, LaJuan, about this letter when we were dating years ago. And she reminded me of it. And she made me go and get it out. And she made me read it. Read what Alden Morris wrote to you. He reminded you of your roots. He reminded you that you were once one of these kids running around on the college campus with your head full of all ideas and whatnot. He told you that as a senior member of the community, they looked to you for leadership, that you had to have patience, that you needed to help them, not just scold them. Keep that in mind, says LaJuan, reminding me of what my colleague in Black academia and my fellow Chicagoan from the same post-Second World War baby boom generation had to say to me. Keep your feet on the ground, Glenn. Don't forget where you came from, Glenn. Don't forget your Uncle Alfred saying to you, this is LaJuan, saying to you once, we could only send one to Harvard and MIT and all of that. We sent you. And we don't see us in anything you do. This is what my uncle said to me on one occasion. LaJuan knows about this because I've shared it with her. She's kind of my conscience in a way. You're still a Black man from the South Side of Chicago. Don't you ever forget that. That's not nothing. It's not an answer to the question of what to do about affirmative action and what to say about George Floyd riots, but it's not nothing.
Mm-mm. It isn't. And, it's interesting. I don't know if I should go here. My ex was white, and I think to myself, it'd be interesting because I don't want a cheerleader. I don't want somebody who doesn't get me, but I would want somebody who was also a constructive critic too. And it's occurred to me that if that were a Black woman, she would do it particularly well. There are all sorts of nuances that she would get. There are all sorts of resonances and historical aspects of it. She would be the best person for that. But unfortunately, and this, I shouldn't say this publicly, but you know what? Life is short. Unfortunately, so many educated Black women find views like yours and mine repulsive that the pool is narrowed. It's not impossible. There are educated women who could deal with this, so to speak.
I hope I'm married to one of them.
Yeah, but for a great many, it would, somebody like me would seem just, de-racialized, doesn't like his own people. I mean, it's in many fields, it's the heart of education to be taught this particular kind of hyper woke ideology. And so it's hard for me to say where that's going to go. And I want to reiterate, I'm not saying that there are no Black women who understand the way somebody like me thinks. There are plenty. That's why I say these things in the public. Nevertheless, in the circles that you and me travel in, it can be hard to find that woman. So it's interesting. I wouldn't mind having that counselor because most white women, through no fault of their own, probably couldn't do it as well as Lawan. Nevertheless, life is complicated. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's move on. I think your inbox is going to be full of invitations to virtual meeting place by suitors.
It's going to be full of various people very angry at what I just said.
That too, but you're now declared a very eligible bachelor, John.
I doubt it. Is it my turn or your turn?
It's your turn, John. Let's move on.
James Velitis says, I can think of no conversation in much of the UK and the US improved by a focus on race. Necessary discussions that need to take place on the inability of certain groups to truly prosper are, in my mind, better served by a focus on that about which we care. Race is always a proxy. If we care about educational disparity, we need to look at economic conditions and social norms. Often a certain race will be disproportionately represented within the variable on which we focus, but race is as useless as caring whether more of the people have blue eyes. James, I get what you mean, but you're too advanced. And what the response would be from many people is that even though race is technically a fiction, even though race does not correlate perfectly with the factors that we're talking about, such as socioeconomic problems, nevertheless, the fundamental task of the morally engaged human being in our times is battling power differentials, and the ones between white and Black people are especially important because this nation, not to mention the one that I suspect you're part of, were founded economically on the backs of people with Black skin. A fundamental injustice has been done. Therefore, undoing the legacies of that is crucially important, probably worth a certain amount of oversimplification. And to only think about class won't work because even though technically that's a kind of power, more of the people numerically within the lower or even the lower middle classes are white. And that would mean that we were thinking about helping white people. And that won't do because white people, no matter what position they occupy in society, harbor a certain privilege. And what we're trying to do is undo the privilege that white people have over Black people. And therefore, to these people, what you're saying sounds too abstract. It sounds like you're not acknowledging the slave trade and its centrality to what became the UK and the United States. And also, to be honest, an awful lot of people have formed an entire sense of what makes them important around battling racial discrimination. And if you present to them the idea that we're going to talk about class, we're going to talk about somebody who bakes bread for a living as opposed to somebody who runs a corporation, they don't get that sense of importance from that. Now, I'm not going to say importance. It's not about arrogance. They don't get that sense of basic significance. They don't have that sense of a life purpose from engaging in something like that. They need, if they're Black, they need it to be about that particular facet of their being. If they're white, they need to be able to feel that they are part of this redressing the legacies of racism. Classism doesn't give the same sense of place, of significance. And so I hear you. If we started everything again, James, I think that, yes, unbiased observers might say. The problem here is that some people have a whole lot more resources than others, and there are an awful lot of people of all sorts of colors in among those who don't have enough. We cannot undo everything and look at it that way under these conditions. There are too many people who are quite powerful and quite influential who simply wouldn't know where to stand if it wasn't all about race. And they think that they have a case because the UK and the United States came into being on the backs of people who were of a different race. That to them is sacrosanct. And there's nothing you could say to them that would make them let that go, because it's now penetrated their emotions and their sense of identity, as well as their left brains. And I can't see our way out of that. What about you,
Ron? I hear you. I don't know if there's any going back or not. I don't know how to, reweave the fabric once you pull it on the loose thread. It looks like it's unraveled. I hear that Columbia is going to have a separate graduation ceremony for students of color or for Black students. Did I get that correct?
Well, yeah, but also of disadvantaged students in general, which I think is pretty cool.
Is it just one ceremony for people of color and disadvantaged, or separate?
No, there's a separate one, I think, for people who were just first generation to go to college. And then there's one for LGBTQIA plus people. And the thing is, this isn't new. The news has distorted this. It's that there's one big graduation, and then there's this sub-ceremony you might go to. There's been a Black one since forever, and I remember them at Stanford and Berkeley way back.
And so the schools like the business school or the School of Communications or whatever might also have a ceremony. Maybe the departments might have their concentrators come over for something with the parents after the general ceremony.
So you have a bunch of little things to go to.
Maybe the fraternities have something going on. I mean, I'm guessing. I don't know what the deal is, but if affinity groups of a variety of different kinds have supplemental ceremonies.
The media are making it sound like something bizarre is going on.
That's true. That's the message that I got. I got the message that there's somehow a segregated graduation going on by race. And
business as usual.
Alarming to me.
Yeah. No, I think it's great. I remember at Stanford when I was a grad student, the undergraduates who I knew because I had TA'd them or I'd been in the theater with them or something like that. The Black undergrads, as graduating seniors, they would go to the main ceremony. Then I'd meet some of them and they would come glowing from the Black graduation ceremony where they had gotten to reconnect with everybody they had known there. And it's not like no white people were allowed, but it was just this little sub ceremony that you went to. I couldn't see anything wrong with it. It just it was one more way of saying goodbye to some people. But the media sometimes make those separate graduations sound like some sort of sinister powwow, or they make it sound like a Black student doesn't graduate with everybody else. No, and Columbia's just proliferated those sub-ceremonies. I don't know to what degree that's just for this year, but if they did proliferate them, it's harmless. If I were a first-generation college student, I wouldn't mind going to a sub-ceremony where there were other first-generation college graduates and you could all talk about how proud you are of being that person. It's perfectly ordinary. Yeah.
Okay, so here's a thought, and then we can move on to the next thing. But here's the thought. Is there any going back? Is there any reversing the emphasis on race? Is there any reweaving the unraveled fabric? If there's any hope at all, I think it is in the social spaces, the emotional and moral spaces created by intermarriage, by marriage across the lines. I'm thinking about Thomas Chatterton Williams' nice book, Self-Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race. And I'm thinking that it's in those marginal spaces, the in-between spaces, the second generation, the third generation of mixed race, of biracial, however you want to call it. I think this idea that he identifies as Black is very thin. I think it's a first generation multiracial thing, but I don't know that it persists to the next and the next and the next generations. I'm wondering if we can't envision a situation, a generation or two from now, in which the great grandchild of a mixed race person. Father is black, mother is white. But that kid married a white person. But they had 3 kids, 2 of whom married black and 1 of whom married white. But the one who married white had a kid, etc. You know, Thomas is looking, he's a child of a African-American father and a white American mother, and he's married to a French woman, so his child is quote unquote 1/4 black. When you get to 1/8 and when you get to 1/16, the artifice of putting on this racial cloak and identifying oneself in this rather artificial and forced way starts to become more and more obvious. And if I'm talking about 1/2 of 1% of the population, that's one thing. But if I'm talking about 15% of the population, that's a different story altogether. The narratives start to shift, the norms and expectations start to bend. So I don't know if we can be so certain that contemporary arrangements survive. And I think the place to find out is to look in these marginal spaces, in the in-between spaces of people who don't quite fit into the boxes unless you force them into them. They may well start to object at being forced to define themselves in ways that fit nicely into the pat categories that we have inherited.
Yeah, that is true. And it's going to be a generational business where it's going to get to the point that there's a critical mass of people who are just mutts, who could be anything, who are going to bristle against the idea that all of them have to identify as something called African American. It's going to be a little while. It's interesting. I remember I visited Harvard maybe 20 years ago now, actually. It was, come to think of it, it was the time we met. It was that we talked about last time. I remember that was the first time I had really heard the word biracial. There was a grad student who introduced herself, clearly despised me, but introduced herself anyway. And she identified as biracial. And she was, looks the way what used to be called mixed. And I thought, okay, biracial, I guess that's going to be the new term. And it was. Then another person came up to me, also clearly despised me, but wanted to sniff me out. And she, I'm talking to this white woman. And at some point in the middle of the conversation, she smilingly says, and I'm black. And physically, she looked precisely white, not a little high yellow, not what it's often said black people can kind of tell, none of it. It was a Caucasian woman physically who was, for some reason, I never got to know her, saying that she was black. And I remember thinking, which way is this going to go? Because this person is clearly has got something going on. Then there's this biracial person. But the thing is, Glenn, it's not going to be soon, because you can talk about Thomas and his ideas about how these extremely cafe au lait, blue-eyed people, we need to stop telling them that they're black. And I have watched people's backs get up. You bring that up, intelligent, middle-aged black people, I have brought this sort of thing up, and just, they can't have it. The idea that this person who's brown at all is going to not say that they're African American is to them just, it gets their back up. These are people who are going to go to their grave unable not to process that as some kind of an affront, as some being in denial of something. And I even asked with one of these people, okay, but this person probably isn't going to get pulled over by the cops, which frankly is a lot of what that person is thinking. But no, they keep on shaking their head, looking off into the distance. It's visceral. And I have also seen that with white people who feel like it's their duty to attest to the idea that anybody who's got a drop of anything is in danger of being discriminated against. You don't know what they're going to run up against. There is a wall, but that's we olds, as they call it. The question is going to be what people think who are ahead of us, who will be middle-aged in 50 years. And I think it'll be different, but a lot of the people around us are never going to let go of it. And if you tell them, aren't you recapitulating the one drop rule from the old days? That they look over your shoulder, they maybe admit that you kind of have a point, but you are not going to budge them. Sometimes you just can't budge somebody. And that I find on that topic, that's one of them. How dare you say you're not black, even if you're this, not me, but this little mixed person. I'd be interested to see where that is in 20 years. And yes, I'm thinking about one of my kids in particular. What
I wanted to ask you about your kids, John, and excuse me if this is too intrusive. No. But your wife, as you just said, is white, and your kids are biracial. What is
Mhm.
your vision about their identity, if any, and how do you handle the questions that must come up, and what pressures from the school as they try to categorize and things of this kind?
Well, one of the things, it's funny, the 6 year old is a little more hip to this sort of thing than the 9 year old at this point. And I think it's partly just what they're like as people. But the 6 year old is also a little darker. She's, about my color. Whereas the 9 year old is classic high yellow. Is she going to identify as a Black woman? I don't know. I suspect she might identify as just half of her mother and half of her dad and is going to just be herself and probably will be joined in that by a great many other mutt kids that she's growing up around. That's my guess. With Vanessa, it becomes more complicated because she's darker. She looks Mexican. Nobody is ever going to think she's white or anything close. And so, what is she going to identify as? I guess she has to identify as something, and I guess that would be Black. But culturally, what they're growing up as is upper middle class mutt girls who, watch Peppa Pig, and it's just I don't know. I'll be interested to see. And there are going to be issues that come up, and I'm going to be the one who's going to have to discuss them with them because their mother is white, and so she's very hip to these things. But they're things that are only going to be able to come from me. We'll see, and God knows what the schools are going to do to them, and so we'll see about that too. Yeah,
That's very heavy. That's heavy.
I've already explained to
Okay,
them though
well, shall
about
we
what
move on?
slavery and Jim Crow were. I thought they should know that. Anyway, go ahead.
Of course, they should know that.
Hmm.
Every kid should know that.
Even
But
at
those kids
6,
should know that.
they should know what Black history was. And they're learning it, that not too long ago, things were very, very different. Like roughly right before Daddy was born, it was a very different world. They're beginning to get that. But what the schools are going to add to it, I don't know. Anyway.
We reproduce these narratives and these social categories through everyday life, and we're kind of, it's a tar baby. You can't let go of race. It's very hard to, you take one hand off, you can't get the other, you can't get the other hand off. I don't know if that's a useful metaphor or not, but it
Well,
strikes me as
remember,
very hard
it's a
to get out.
slur, Glenn. Tar baby is a slur. You know how that comes up in the news about once every 7 or 8 years, that
Oh
tar
no, I'm
baby,
unaware of that, and I meant no offense to anybody out there. I just meant literally, you're
a tar
stuck
baby.
with your
Yeah.
hands on tar, and you can't get, because there's nothing to hold on to without getting stuck. That's all I
Mhm.
meant. Let's move on. Glenn, could you explore? This is Zachary. Zachary asks, could you explore, Glenn, your relationship with Amy Wax? Have the two of you had a falling out? No, we have not had a falling out. Let me just tell people who don't know, Amy Wax is a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania who is notorious for controversy because some years ago, with a colleague, she published an op-ed piece in which she advocated a return to bourgeois middle class values circa 1950s America, where there were two-parent families and there was a lot of emphasis on hard work, and there was women were not quite liberated yet. Not that she's against women's liberation, but she's against the decline, the increase in divorce and the decline of marriage, and against the seeming abandonment of what had been taken to be kind of bourgeois norms, which she say are better suited to prosper in modern industrial civilization for people, and that was very controversial. And she also uh, became the center of a firestorm of protest and outrage at the University of Pennsylvania Law School when she said publicly, actually on the Glenn Show, when I was interviewing her, that there were noticeable racial differences in the quality of intellectual performance amongst her students at the Penn Law School. Rarely, she said, did you see a student who was Black in the top half, or certainly very rarely in the top quarter of their classes. In her experience, this was a statement that elicited furious response from the legal academic community, especially at Penn. And Amy's head was called for on a platter. The dean relieved her of responsibility for teaching required courses to first-year students in the law curriculum at Penn after she made this statement. We don't want to go into all the details because it would take too long. But in any case, that's who Amy Wax is. So the question is, could I explore my relationship with her and have we had a falling out? I had her on the Glenn Show as a guest, and she's been on several times. I don't know, 4 or 5 times over the course of the last, 5 or 6 years. But not recently, not in the last, year or two. That is not a result of any argument between Amy Wax and myself. Amy Wax is my friend. I admire and respect her. I don't agree with everything she says, but I think she's extremely smart, and I think she's courageous. She's also abrasive. She is. She does not suffer fools gladly. She has very sharp-edged opinions. As I say, I don't share them all, but I do share some of them, many of them. And she can be acerbic in the way in which she expresses those opinions. She turns people off. She's the Jordan Peterson of the legal academy or something like that. I mean, in the sense that there are people who just react to her viscerally. They've heard that she has said 1 or 2 things. They don't like her demeanor. That some people cannot stand the sound of her voice. I've had people say to me, how many times are you going to have her on? How many times are you going to have her on? Like that. Now, I can't say for certain that the length of time between my last conversation with Amy Wax on the Glenn Show and now is as long as it is. I can't say for certain that hasn't been at all influenced, maybe subliminally, by my knowing that if I have her on, I'm going to get flack from people about having her on again, giving her a platform and so forth and so on. I sure hope not. I hope that's not true about myself. I would like to think not. But, the subconscious, I think Freud has something to say about this. I don't know. I'm not sure. But I will be having her back. Amy and I, the last time we talked, it hasn't been 2 years. That's not true. It's probably been less than a year. We talked about Charles Murray's book, Human Diversity. And I'm not going to go into the book. You know who Charles Murray is, the bell curve fame. Charles's sweeping survey of social science knowledge about population differences for human beings who descend from geographically segregated populations, Northeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, Northern Europe, the Americas. To what extent are there, and he doesn't just talk about race or population, he doesn't call it race, he calls it population differences. He also talks about gender or sex, men and women, and he talks about the extent to which social class outcome differences may reflect differences in human functioning that are biogenetic of character. This is Charles Murray. There's a book. Amy and I discussed it. It's the kind of thing that she would be eager about discussing. She would give time to the racial realists who entertain hypotheses about biogenetic influences in human populations, and that infuriates people. There's a cultural conservatism in Amy, and there's a kind of social methodological intellectual conservatism in Amy, and it drives people crazy. I don't always agree with it, but I think she's very smart and thoughtful and is worth engaging along those questions. I'll tell you, my first encounter with Amy Wax face to face did not go well. The year was 2010 or 2011. It was the academic year 2010, 2011. You may remember, John, I was a visiting faculty member at Columbia during that academic year.
Not that long ago.
And I, it's that long ago, man. It's 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
They invited me at Penn Law to come and talk about race, incarceration, and American values, which is my 2008 book based on the Tanner lectures that I gave at Stanford in 2007. It's a little book of essays built off of 2 lectures that I gave at Stanford. And in those years, I was very much up in arms about the social injustice of the racial disparity in the incidence of incarceration in the United States and what that said about us as a country. And so I went to Penn Law and I gave a long talk, an hour long to the faculty seminar in which I held forth about how the deep questions of social justice challenged us in the face of this huge racial disparity in incarceration. I said things like, a million cases, each one rightly decided before the law, can still cumulatively add up to a great and historic injustice. The incidence of by race of imprisonment challenged the country in a fundamental way, I said, and I would stand by that, frankly, although my emphasis might be a little bit different today, especially given that I would speak today against the backdrop of Black Lives Matter and such. But in any case, I gave this talk. Amy was in the audience. She's the first questioner. She stands up and says, you say there are too many Blacks in prison. I'm here to tell you that there are too few. There are not enough Blacks in prison. What do you have to say to that, Professor Loury? And then she went on, look at the crime rates, look at the victimization rates, look at the racial differences in participation in crime. It matches up or even is in excess of the representation of Blacks amongst the incarcerated. She challenged me frontally in front of the faculty to justify why there were too many and not too few Blacks in prison. I responded. I don't know how effectively I responded. I said something. I was furious. I got back to my desk at Columbia, where I was a visiting professor, and immediately wrote to the dean, then dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, denouncing the racist professor. I don't think I called her a racist, but that was the implication of my letter, who I said it was all I could do not to rip her head off. This is what I wrote in my letter to the dean. I meant that metaphorically, of course. I didn't mean physical violence. But I was furious that she had dared to commit the outrageous act of asserting that there are too few Blacks in prison after I had just given my eloquent disquisition explaining why there were too many. Now, when I did that, I was doing the same kind of cancel culture thing that you and I would be quick to condemn nowadays. But I did it. I did it nonetheless. What are you doing, John? You're moving. You're on the move.
Keep going.
Okay, well, yeah, you better do that. No. I was mad at Amy Wax. I wrote to the dean. The dean wrote back with a very apologetic letter. I don't know whether or not he called Amy on the carpet to tell her that this Black professor, look, I'm playing the race card. I'm a Black professor. I'm distinguished visiting professor at Columbia, got a chair at Brown. And I'm in there, and I came down to Philly to give them a talk. And, I'm preaching the gospel of social justice according to John Rawls and company. And I got my facts and whatnot. And here she fronts me and she challenges me with this outrageous, unspeakable, politically incorrect question. There are too few Blacks in prison, Professor Loury. I'm sorry, you've got it exactly backwards. And I'm furious, and I write to the dean. That was the beginning of our relationship with Amy Wax, my relationship with Amy Wax. I said, who is this woman? I then went and read her book, Race, Wrongs, and Remedies.
And it's a good one.
And I thought, it's a good book. I thought it's smart, it's well written, and she's actually right, I thought. Her argument in that book was Black people have some responsibility for remedying the consequences of them having been victimized by racism. Whatever you may think of them having been victimized, there is a considerable amount of weight on the shoulders of African Americans to respond appropriately to the fact of their victimization. If we ever want to get out of this box, she gives an analogy. She says a person can get hit by a bus. They step off the curb. The bus hits them. The bus driver maybe is texting and should be paying attention. And so it's definitely at fault. And there's no doubt that the person has been victimized by the negligent behavior of the bus driver. And now they have a crushed leg and they can't walk. Now a year goes by, 2 years goes by, 3 years go by. They are in a wheelchair and they still can't walk. If they don't get up and go to physical therapy, if they don't endure the painful treatments necessary to restore their function, they're never going to walk again. The bus driver may have been responsible for what the bus driver did, but the victim of the accident is responsible to take the actions necessary to allow for their own recovery. By analogy, the fact of historical wrong does not mean that there is a remedy that can get off the ground without the active participation of African Americans themselves in solving the problem. And I thought this is This is a thoughtful woman. This is a courageous woman. I learned more about her. She's got a medical degree as well as a law degree. She is a very knowledgeable, erudite person in the fields in which she's active. She's a serious person, and my friendship with her, I've grown. I've learned from her. I'm in a way proud of the fact that we started out at loggerheads. With me with my backup as the angry black man, and that we were able to get past that and develop a mutually respectful relationship. So Amy and I are okay, and she'll be back.
Good.
You want to take up one last question, John?
I don't know.
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, I don't want to cut you short at all.
Yeah, go ahead. I have come to the end of my time for the most part, but I want to say that Amy's analogy is brilliant. It's perfect. I mean, whatever you feel about race issues, whether you're on the left or the right, you should be able to listen to that parable about the fact that, a black person is responsible. And people don't like that word responsible. Maybe there's another way of putting it, but only the black person in question can teach themselves how to walk again, however culpable the bus driver is. That's just simple fact. You can't deny it. And unfortunately, I find it memorable that a response that got around to that, apparently a smart black law student said, the analogy is off. It's as if the black person is getting run over by the bus over and over again. So the idea is that racism is so pervasive, even if it's systemic, that it's as if you're trying to walk, but then you keep getting run over by the bus. And I think many of us would say, no, racism itself of any quantity does not qualify as a bus running over you. But I don't know if we could get that across to that black law student. And that black law student now is probably a black law professor teaching other black law students to think the way he does. So, yeah, but I have always thought that was a touchstone analogy. You cannot call that right-wing boilerplate. That is just pure logic and common sense. And yet, look, it doesn't get around much. And that is unfortunately partly because Amy is not one for trying to get into other people's heads and to say things in ways that won't make them angry. That's just not what she does. And so you end up getting to the kinds of people who aren't terribly interested in making the difference between the logic of someone's arguments and how they feel about that person emotionally. Not everybody is up for making that distinction. I would venture to say, frankly, that most people aren't. And so her influence ends up being narrower than it could be. But that analogy in particular, gold, pure spun gold. Yep.
All right. I guess we're at the end of our time. John has to run to dinner somewhere. I hope you enjoy it, John. I want to remind $5 tier patrons who are hearing these responses. You too can put a question to Glenn and John for our monthly Q&A if you upgrade your support of the Glenn Show at patreon.com/Glenn Show. So that's it, John. Thanks a lot.
Perfect, Glenn. Talk to you very soon.
Righto.